All right, everybody, let's take seats. We are carrying on our series. So you guys know that on Sundays we never have the stool up here. I was watching myself give the Sunday service and I kept seeing the stool up here. So when my husband went and put it up here, my initial thought was, that's deep. Gordon's operating in the prophetic this morning. So today is transacting. You're deep. You're deep. Transacting in the Spirit. We've been covering how to discern in the Spirit, how to understand what different types of spirits are operating. We learned a little bit about counterfeit spirits, familiar spirits, territorial spirits. Now we really have to understand the transactional nature of spiritual warfare. Who's pumped for it? Everyone ready for that? So spiritual warfare, it's not like you just kind of like, I think sometimes when people hear about this, and Gordon, I hope you don't mind me using you and Seb as an example. When we came home from doing baptisms this week, Gordon, your question was like, so I don't just tell me, like, do you hear it? Do you see it? Like, how does it all go down? And then Zev brought the same sort of like childhood curiosity, like, Mom, so it sounds so cool what you did. Like, do you see it? Do you hear it? So I think it's important that we understand the multidimensional nature of transactions so that we can actually bring this to life. Because it isn't like I just sit there and like pretend. It's not like little kid make-believe. You know, we were like, I'm going to put on a skirt and a crown and I'm going to pretend to be a princess today. There's more to it than I'm just simply pretending to do this. I put on an outfit that makes it look like I'm ready for prophetic deliverance and then boom, it happens. So I want us to understand the transactional nature because God has called us into being able to do these things for his people to edify the church, but we can't do it if we don't understand how the transaction works, right? So a transaction is an exchange or an interaction between two people or groups. So when we think of what's happening in a spiritual transaction, there's something in the natural world that's engaging with something in the spiritual world. So there's a give and take relationship. There is a causation system that's happening. But I think it's important. It can happen both ways. If you look at these arrows, I picked them on purpose, right? The spirit realm can incite an action in the physical realm, but the physical realm can actually also incite an action in the spiritual realm. I think sometimes we miss that part of it. There's that duality. It's often feeling like we're only acted upon by the spirit realm, but that's not true. We have the ability to act upon the spirit realm from the physical as well. So when we're talking about the physical versus the spiritual world, what we're talking about is the visible versus the invisible. Or in other words, the material versus the immaterial. So when we're talking about a dimensional conversation, some Christians will just immediately check out and be like, this isn't biblical. If you don't believe it's biblical, please go back and watch Manifold. It's on our YouTube channel. It's free. It's definitely biblical. When we're talking about the interaction between the visible and the invisible, we're talking about a multidimensional conversation. As soon as we move beyond the purely three-dimensional physical material world, we're talking about a multidimensional space that transcends what we can see with our naked eye. Many people that want to seek out science to disprove God are forgetting that you can't cut open and cross-section the fifth dimension and beyond. So you can't ever try to prove the existence of God or disprove it using purely physical paradigmatic constraints. It's not possible. You'll block yourself from being able to get the very conclusion that you're looking for. So we want to be thinking about the material, right? Like something that you could physically tap on versus that which you can't see. For us to start to break down this dimensional conversation, it's important to remember that in the third dimension where we are here, the material world, we experience time unfold chronologically. Biblical language, this would be Kronos, versus the way God's timing unfolds is Kairos. It's God's time. It transcends our three-dimensional space-time. So if we were to look at this in biblical terms, we would see that Genesis precedes the crucifixion precedes Revelation, right? So that's kind of a nice little timeline for us. Here's what actually happened. It's kind of messy. So what were the prophets able to do? right? So the prophets weren't time-bound. That's ultimately what made them prophets. So what we see happening is that, let's start at Genesis on the far left. What's really happening is that the Bible, it's a closed system, right? Like it ends at Revelation. Agree? Our Bible ends at Revelation. Are there other books I'm unaware of that go after Revelation? Okay. So we've got Genesis to Revelation closes the loop. I plotted the crucifixion here just because it makes it a nice half circle, but there's no specific reason that I placed the crucifixion there. Otherwise, it just looks nicer. So what we see here is that between Genesis and the crucifixion, we have Old Testament prophets actually grabbing information, data, multidimensionally from the future to bring it back to the Word so that we see that there's a future reference that we can be prepared for as time is unfolding. So what we really have is that each of these lines are like a prophet moving forward into the future, pulling that information back, plopping it in the Bible. Right? So the whole Bible is a prophetic declaration, agree? That doesn't mean that the experience that the prophets are having is time-bound. When they're able to go and grab that information to prophesy, to bring the word into the Bible, they are no longer time-bound in that moment. God created all, and what's important for us to remember is that God declared the beginning and the end. So the end is already known. We're just experiencing this very messy unfolding process, but the beginning and the end has already been prophesied. Everyone feels that, right? So there's kind of this, we're somewhere stuck in this middle in all of the chaos and the unfolding and a battle between good and evil, but ultimately we already know the end. This helps us have a visual representation of what happens once we move beyond the third dimension. So in the third dimension, we are time-bound. It's the nature of the third dimension. It's the nature of what happened to us at the time of the fall. When we fell, right, all of a sudden we died. We got blinded by the third dimension. It was impossible for us to purely be led by the Spirit, because we were distracted with the physical world. A good example of this, going back to Genesis, is when Adam and Eve didn't know they were naked because there was really no such thing as the third dimensional time-bound material world. When they fell, all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, we're naked. How did they not know they were naked before? Was it magic? No. After the fall, they all of a sudden were aware of their material bodies and were like, oh Lord, I need to cover up. Before that, there was no, like, what would cover up have meant? So we have time-bound 3. Then we move into the 4th dimension, which we know even from quantum physics and physics in general is the actual boundary of space-time. So I like to think of this as a time distortion field. Once we get into that 4th dimensional space, time can be distorted and manipulated. A good example of this would be if you've ever done hallucinogens. Are you very clear on how long it's been exactly since you've been doing the thing? No, you lose time. Just like sometimes when you're really sick and you have a fever and you go into kind of a fever hallucination, you might think it's been 30 minutes and someone's like, oh no, you were asleep for like 15 hours. We were worried that you died. You go into a space where you're no longer aware of the unfolding of time chronologically. Here's an important piece. In that space, do you think you are more vulnerable to the enemy? Extremely more vulnerable. When we understand how time is unfolding and we understand who we are, what we are, where we are, and we are of sober mind, it acts as a tether, right? Like an astronaut would use to tether themselves to the spaceship. We know how far away we've strayed, and then we know how to map our way back. Once you lose that tether and you're not clear on who you are, or where you are, or what's going on, it becomes more challenging to try to navigate your way back. So do we think Satan loves to manipulate people into going into the time distortion field? It's actually one of his favorite things to do. We've seen this happen even culturally. Now all of a sudden, all different types of hallucinogenics are now medicine. Oh, you're struggling with being a mom? Let's do ketamine. Ketamine's you're gonna love being a mom once you start doing ketamine treatments. Ketamine is animal tranquilizer. Thanks, Big Pharma. So when we look at a time distortion field, things like medicine, things like even pharmaceutical drugs to help with psychological disorders, a lot of the help that they're doing in the psychological disorders it's causing a host of other problems. In general, big pharma interventions create what's called a cascading effect. So they might temporarily mitigate the symptoms of one thing, but the big picture is that there's a domino effect that takes place where it actually pushes people more out of their sovereignty and their spiritual identity. Another example of this, for all of you conspiracy theorists out there, would be like fluoride in the water. I'll let you rabbit hole yourselves on that one, have fun. So those all push us into a time distortion experience where it's easier for us to be manipulated. A lot of the teens right now that we have falling into the trans agenda, many of them are on extensive medications. They're being manipulated from the outside through the school system, through peer groups, and then they're also on medication. They're already not clear on what these sovereign boundaries are, and they're operating in this time distortion. It makes them very prime for attack by the enemy. Then when we move past the fourth dimension, we get to the fifth dimension and beyond. Many scholars that have really dissected this biblically would place essentially the courts of heaven and where God resides about the seventh dimension. I've done extensive teaching on this in Biomechanics of Deliverance, so if you want to dig more into that, that's a good place to go. So let's just say that for now, biblical concepts and quantum physics agree that once you move into the fifth dimension, there is no such thing as time anymore. We're now no longer time-bound at all. It's not just a time distortion, it's completely timeless. When we're talking about a spiritual transaction, and this is so important for some of you that have friends that are still very deep in spiritual medicine journeys, when we're actually transacting in the spirit, are we transacting in the fourth dimension or the fifth dimension and beyond? Fifth and beyond. Anytime, and actually this is really key, most of the practices, spiritual practices that Satan wants you participating in, where are you transacting? 4. So you're transacting in 4, and because it seems like it breaks the laws of the natural world, and it seems like it displays some sort of power, people get deceived into believing this is God, right? It doesn't take much for the average person, as soon as they see what they believe to be an immutable law of the natural world, once they see that immutable law break, they're like, wow, it's just the nature of us, right? We want to believe in something beyond who we are. We want to believe in something beyond our limitations. But the reality is, once we get into that fourth dimension time distortion field, we're operating in a place in the spirit realm that we, A, have no business being, and many people are doing that without discernment. And anything that they see that seems to go against the laws of the natural world feels like God. But does that mean that it's God? No. So when we are transacting in the spirit realm, we need to make sure that we are actually going as far out as we should be. When Jesus is transacting in the spirit realm and delivering people, there might be pieces, right? If you kind of go on this visual with me, imagine that Jesus is operating from fifth dimension and beyond. Imagine that he has like a minnow catching net. Everyone follow me? Have Jesus hold a minnow catching net. So imagine as he's delivering people, he might be collecting things in that fourth dimension time distortion field, but that is not where the bulk of the transaction's taking place, right? So there can be contamination and pieces that need to be removed from that space, but that is not where the transaction itself is taking place or should be taking place. Time distortion field would be things like astral projection, right? Where you get that feeling of like, ooh, this is so cool. That is not the edge of where we need to be transacting in the spirit as Christians. I love this visual. The Bible we know is multidimensional, and it is a framework. The Bible is a framework that both teaches us who to be, who we actually are, how we should walk out our life, but also, very importantly, it teaches us how to understand laws of the spiritual realm. It's not that hard to figure out the laws of the physical realm, right? If you trip over something, you fall, and you experience what people have decided to call gravity, right? We have physical experiences that teach us the laws of the natural world. We can experience the limitations. I, despite my gifting, can't move this stool with my mind yet. But when we think about spiritual laws, where other than the Bible, where do we really have an appropriate framework to understand the step-by-step sequence of how the spiritual laws work? We don't really. Satan has given us a variety of different books and channelings that teach us how to navigate in the fourth dimension time distortion field, but that's actually such a manipulated structure. A lot of people that talk about the matrix, that's kind of more that sort of like matrix holographic reality thing where it really is just a distortion field. God has made us to be able to operate far beyond that space, and many of us get tricked into stopping at 4. So we need to remember that God has called us to do this work, but we have to understand spiritual laws so that we know how to transact. We know that God is a God of law and order and process. Tiff, I know that you've said this before, and I'm hoping that you will do a teaching on it. I'm like kind of probably changing your words, and I hope that I'm not, but you said something about like Satan basically is a biblical scholar, and he has to understand how he can try to find the the seeming vulnerabilities in God's law so that he can manipulate us, which is true. For Satan to be able to do what he does, he has to understand all of God's law and spiritual law so he can try to find the things that we think are gray area. That doesn't mean they are gray area. He just knows that there are certain things that we're not going to be clear on, and it's easier to press those wounds to manipulate us than anything else. This is the same as if we were to go into a courtroom. For you to be a great attorney, you have to understand your opposing counsel's argument. If you don't understand your opposing counsel's argument, how can you dismantle it? You can't. You can't just be up there and be like, I'm only really good at what I'm good at, and I don't know anything that's happening on the other side. You have to know how to specifically and strategically attack all of the weaknesses in opposing counsel's argument. God gave us a book to know opposing counsel's argument. There is a specific sequence. There is actually, taking it this far, there is actually even a specific sequence of how we bring things to petition in the courts of heaven. People just don't do this. They think that somehow spiritual transactions, like you said, are just little kids like putting on make-believe playing dress up, and they're like, so I'm going to do these things, and like it sounds like this will work. There's a real process, and I believe God wants us to roll up our sleeves and get into the process. So we're going to be going through 9 types of transactions. There's a different way to use each transaction, and it's important to know when to use what. So different situations call for certain spiritual transactions, and we need to know what the situation is calling for. And sometimes it's a combination. Spiritual laws are exploited by the enemy, and most Christians are not willing to figure out where Satan exploits these laws because they just want to believe that God's already won, there's no point in figuring this out, and like the enemy doesn't really have that much power. And it's not about the enemy having power, right? This is a trick. The enemy is playing dirty here. He's exploiting what we believe are weaknesses. That is the key. Because a lot of Christians want to be like, there is no weakness, it's God. God didn't make a mistake. God's not trying to exploit, or Satan's not trying to exploit God. He's trying to exploit our understanding and interpretation. You get that, yeah? So let's start with covenants. The covenants are pretty obvious. A lot of people have heard the word covenant. A covenant is a binding or establishing of a formal relationship between two parties. So typically when we talk about covenants in the Bible, we're talking about Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, and of course, Jesus. So they're called the Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant are what they're referred to. So we know with Noah, God said, hey, you do this for me and I will maintain your seed, essentially because everybody else was so corrupted at that point that he was like, I'm betting on you, buddy. Don't let me down. I'm going to take out everybody else, but I'm betting on you, right? Then we've got the Abrahamic, same thing, right? God kind of selects one person because he's seeing, okay, you're my best chance of clearing out this bloodline and making the way for Jesus. If we look all the way down, these are all making the way to Jesus' bloodline, right? They're all ultimately covenants that are building one into the next to the next. So similarly with Moses and David, With David in particular, at that point, God knew that that would be the last covenant to bring Jesus into his bloodline. So that one actually stands out and is very important. And then, of course, the last one is the new covenant that Jesus makes on our behalf. So oftentimes here, God's future kingdom that he's trying to build and bloodline that he's trying to preserve, they're the receiver of the covenant. In the new covenant, we all receive it. We also have agreements. So if we go back to the original Hebrew, there's definitely a separation between what word was used. But if you look at any of the newer translations, they seem to use agreements and covenants pretty interchangeably. So I'm putting them on two separate slides because the covenants that we just described are very sole and separate of other more simplified agreements that were made, because there are many that go far beyond those previous ones. So an agreement covenant is a contract between God and his people, typically includes an exchange of something physical. This can be food, an item of clothing, or an establishment of an altar. So when we're thinking about how these agreements work, in general, the most common is the sharing of a meal, right? And in this way, we know that Jesus shared a meal with his disciples to do something just like this. But there also are, like I said, building up altars, right? God telling you to move physical stones and pile them up. So let's go all the way to the right. Genesis 26 through 31, they said, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, let there be a sworn pact between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have not done anything but good and have sent you away in peace. You are now blessed of the Lord. So he made them a feast, and they ate and drank, and in the morning they rose early and exchanged oaths. And Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed him in peace. So there's also this idea of God making a table for us with our enemies. So this is often what happens when we're seeing agreements or covenants being made. These can also be looked at like truces, like, hey, we're deciding to kind of stop doing what we've been doing, but let's share this meal. And this meal that we're sharing is actually a binding oath. So remember that we're talking about how the physical world interacts with the spiritual world. Is the sharing of a meal purely symbolic? If it was purely symbolic, why would they do it so dang much? The physical world is going to actually incite something in the spiritual realm. And then that spiritual realm is going to then come back and reinforce whatever just took place. So there's this full looping effect that ends up happening. So when we are sharing a meal, we have to be intentional with what we're doing. Sometimes you've shared meals with people that wish you harm, and suddenly bad things start to happen to you purely because you went to dinner with that person. And we don't really take it that seriously, but we should. A long time ago, you don't sit down to meals with people that you don't actually want to be in a covenant with. Has that ever happened to somebody where you kind of don't really want to go out to dinner with somebody, but you're like, I kind of have to, and then all of a sudden things start to go negative? We've got to be aware of those things, and we're going to learn how to actually break those covenants. When we did our prophetic deliverance baptisms this week, there were a ton of agreements that people had made unknowingly that were actually holding them back in delay in their lives. We have to be able to repent for and deliver from agreements that we've made both knowingly and unknowingly, and some people just don't want to look at it. Let's take a look at the far left, Genesis 31:43 through 55. Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, and he said to the relatives, gather some stones. So they took stones, piled them up in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Right, so now we've got two things. We're kind of doubling up. We not only are sharing a meal, but we're also going to move some stones to bear witness. This heap is a witness between you and me today. That is why it is called Gilead. It was also called Mizpah because they said, may the Lord keep watch between you and me when they were away from each other. Right, so it's a physical representation of an agreement that God is able to monitor when people are separated from each other. Do we think that the exchanging of wedding rings kind of serves as the same function, right? Like a physical thing that we're exchanging to actually anchor the covenant of marriage? So this is all over the place. We need to be mindful of it. A lot of times we go giving things to people. We're like, I don't know, I just feel like I'm really supposed to give this to you today. And we're not thinking about the spiritual nature of what we're doing, but there's a spiritual act. And sometimes, and this is going to be the case for 3 of you in this room, you've received items from people that were given as a gift that you need to get rid of right away. Sarai, you're actually one of them. You know the bag I'm talking about, right? I just saw it. Did you already give it away? Think about it. So sometimes somebody that actually knowingly wishes to do you harm actually gives you something as a gift, and they might even say that it's kind of like, oh, God asked me to give it to you. You've got to exercise discernment. Just because they said God said doesn't mean God said. So let's take a look at declarations. Declarations are going to be the most common tool that we use in spiritual warfare, and there are a variety of different types of spiritual declaration. So declaration is to state out loud, decree, and make manifest. The most common type of declaration is prophecy, a miraculous declaration and description of something in the future, an inspired utterance from a prophet. We also have rebuking. Not all of you have actually rebuked a spirit, but you will be soon. Demon Slayer. Rebuking, to reprimand or warn. Restoring, to return back to its original state. Blessing, a public declaration of God's favor and love for you. God can bless you, but somebody prophesying can also verbally bless you. Either way, it's God's favor on you. So whether it comes out of somebody who's operating the prophetic's mouth, or God actually blesses you with something physical and obvious, they're both blessings. Preaching, to declare God's truth, speaking from his spirit to proclaim Jesus and the gospel. Last one, cursing. A public declaration of being devoted to destruction. Does God curse things? Does Jesus curse things? So it's important for us to remember that cursing isn't just something that somebody does to us through witchcraft. Cursing actually is a spiritual transactional tool of God as well. And often we don't really want to acknowledge that. We're like, oh, I don't like that part of it. I don't care if you like it. It's still a tool. And sometimes God asks us to use this tool. Let's look at Job 22:28. You will decide on a matter, and it will be established for you, and light will shine on your ways. There's a very clear order here. What happens first? Do you speak something? You decide on a matter, right? You decide what it is that you want or what it is that you're hearing from God. Then you will establish it, and then it becomes what you do. Often people are too quick to speak. Does anybody struggle with this where you're too quick to speak? Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate your honesty there, sir. Sometimes we're too quick to speak. We need to be very mindful. God, part of what discernment is the ability to slow down. Some of you are way too quick to speak, and as a result, your discernment is compromised. We have to be able to slow it down to exercise discernment. Discernment will potentially make us look like we have a buffering face, where it looks like you're like, not really sure what I'm doing, and then you respond. We need to be very intentional with what comes out of our mouth, because God is good and is faithful, and often God will, even as a way to show us the error of our ways, will actually establish something that we speak, even if it's not actually what we should have spoken. I had to come face to face with something that happened to me last night that fits this exact description. Let's look at Matthew 12:37. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Do we think that what we say is very important? Yes. It is very important for us to be intentional with every word that comes out of our mouth. Think about how the enemy will operate with thought forms of negative self-talk, right? The people that keep telling themselves, like, I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm unworthy. Is that them, or is that the enemy operating through a thought form to get them to declare that repeatedly over their own lives? People that are operating with negative self-talk need to be delivered, because in that repetitive speaking over their own lives, they're actually making themselves become this, right? The enemy wants them to see themselves in this very distorted, twisted way, because then it becomes very challenging for God to actually interface with them. The more you allow yourselves to sink into these negative self-talk and intrusive thought patterns, and you're speaking literally death and cursing into your own body, it's like you change the frequency with which God can connect with you. God can always connect with you, but are you in a place where you can receive God, right? I think a lot of Christians take this perspective of like, well, if God wanted to, God would, and that is true, but often we put ourselves into a frequency where we are unwilling. It's not that God's unwilling, we are unwilling at some level to be open to receiving. The more we speak this into ourselves and into our life, the harder it is for us to actually start to hear God. So take a second. Are there any ways that you do this? Because a declaration doesn't have to be something that you actually speak audibly. Many of you are declaring things over your life, even over your kids' lives, because you're thinking them in your head repeatedly. Proverbs 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. This is probably the most common one that people look to understand how we can make things manifest with our words. Isaiah 55:11, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose. I have my old glasses on today. They're not the same prescription, so I'm over here like this. I'm not winking at anybody. I'm trying to read it. And shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. So here, now we're getting into a prophetic declaration. Do you see the difference in the architecture? One is like, yeah, what you say is going to manifest. Then we get into a prophetic declaration, which is what comes out of my mouth will not return empty. It will be. A prophetic declaration is looking into something in the future, proclaiming it now, and then making it manifest. So Proverbs 18:21 is almost a more passive version. Like, be careful because what you say will unfold. The other is actually understanding that spiritual transaction and claiming the nature of the spiritual transaction. Do you see the difference in the architecture of the language? Okay. 1 Kings 18:41-46. So this is a prophetic declaration, a very prominent one with Elijah. So this is when Elijah, it's been a drought for a long time, and Elijah's like, nope, it's gonna rain. And Elijah said unto Ahab, get thee up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of an abundance of rain. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he cast himself down upon the earth and put his face between his knees. That's him praying, right? He's in like a full prayer position. And he said to his servant, go up now, look toward the sea. And he went up and looked and said, there is nothing. And he said, go again 7 times. And it came to pass that at the 7th time that he said, behold, there ariseth a little cloud out of the sea, like a man's hand. And he said, go up, say unto Ahab, prepare thy chariot and get thee down, that the rain stop thee not. And it came to pass in the meanwhile that the heaven was black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So this is a prophetic declaration. Like, there's going to be rain. It's not happening yet. Everyone else that looks is like, you sure, buddy? And he's like, 7 more times, and it's done. So saying there's going to be a rain, you're going to have to go up 7 times, and then it is done, that is a prophetic declaration. And we see, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. So with prophetic declarations, and really actually our entire Bible is prophetic declaration, because the prophet is going forward to something that God is allowing them to then transcribe into our present moment. Prayer is communication with God. This can be both a request or a conversation. It's important for us to remember that God made our bodies to be receivers and transmitters, right? We can receive messages from God, but can we also send out requests, right? God has a request line. It's like TRL. We just ask God for what we need. Thank you for being the only one that got that. No one remembers TRL, or you guys are just not in a giggling mood this morning? So we're able to both request information to integrate that back into our lives, but we're also able to receive information to integrate that back into our lives. Prayer is this call and response sort of nature, but it can be a very specific or explicit request, and it can also be very conversational. Let's look at Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Do we think prayer is an important part of daily life? Does something have to be, seated in a specific position, with your hands up in a certain position, with a certain sort of order to be prayer? No. I pray all the time. I'm probably talking to God 95% of my day. But that doesn't mean that I have to get on my knees and do this to be like, okay, now I'm ready to pray. Sometimes I pray like that, but I'm not praying like that all day long. Sometimes people have this idea of what you're supposed to do to be in prayer, or there needs to be a certain structure to access God. God's always with you. You have to be in the right frequency to be able to tap into that signal. So you might be the kind of person that as you're really digging into your prayer life, you might need to separate yourself. You might need to get on your knees. You might need to break something off of your ego to even be in that place. But I think the goal is to be able to commune with God all the time, not to have to be in a physical position to open yourself up. But that might be required for a time. Jeremiah 33:3, call to me and I will answer you, and will tell you great and hidden things that you have not known. This is the conversation where we're able to receive. Oftentimes people only pray when they need something or when something's going wrong. When you're ready to level up your walk with God and you're ready to truly step into your purpose, prayer needs to be a major part of your life because God has abundant information that he wants to give to you. I highly encourage you to go. This sounds silly. So for those of you that love to learn, you're going to think that what I'm about to say is weird, but go on an educational fast. I'm telling you, oftentimes if there's a certain area of worldly knowledge that we want access to and we want to level up, anchoring yourself into a relationship with a teacher in that subject often won't do as much for you as cutting that stream off and going to God. God is able to provide abundant information for you. And Patty, I believe this one's for you. Just stop it. Stop. Yep. You get it? Yep. God wants to give you all the information. There's no external teacher that is going to be able to provide the revelation that God provides. So stop seeking it. God can provide information that is very specific and seemingly worldly, but he's going to do it through his eyes and his character. So what is going to be born out of it will truly edify the church, not actually deceive people. Mama Tiff, that one's for you too. Go to God. God has so much for you. We need to remember that God is able to provide hidden information. God will often pick certain people to open up troves of information that maybe haven't been opened up for hundreds of years. Everyone will say there's nothing new under the sun, and perhaps that's true because God created all things. However, God does go through periods where he'll hide information, and he'll hide it from us for a reason. And he'll also decide, okay, now you're ready, my daughter. You're ready to receive revelation, and you'll bring something back that was previously covered up. So we need to be ready to receive and stop seeking so many worldly books and worldly teachers. Who loves worship? I love worship. Worship is grateful submission to God with an expression of praise from the most intimate parts of yourself. Let's look at Psalms 100 first. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with your joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. Are we supposed to worship in a very somber, kind of mad state, self-conscious? No. If you're so concerned what other people around you are doing or look like or whether they're looking at you, you're not actually in worship. I hate to break it to you. You might be physically here. You might be physically trying to do it, but if you're still thinking about other people and not just God while you're worshiping, you're not really worshiping yet. And that's okay. Maybe it's going to take you a little bit to break those barriers down, but true worship, everyone else doesn't exist. Only God. John 4:23-24, yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. One way of saying this is physically worshiping here and like saying all the right words and being like, yeah, I'm in the worship band, right? But secretly in your head, you actually love being in the worship band and you love that people love you being in the worship band. Are you worshiping in the spirit or in the physical? Physical, right? And actually, I think for many worship singers, there's probably a moment where they actually get pulled out of something that once was true devotional worship, and just by the nature of how big worship groups can become, you actually start to be worshiping in the physical instead. And I think for a lot of them, it probably breaks them and makes them susceptible to the enemy. Worship should be in the spirit. You should be physically here, but almost forget that you're here. You shouldn't be thinking, wow, this worship is taking what seems like 30 minutes. You shouldn't even be in space-time if you're truly worshiping. So God calls us to worship in a place that is outside of time and space, where only our relationship with him matters. Be honest with yourself. If you haven't reached that place yet, keep stretching yourself. Keep asking questions about why you can't break through that barrier. That barrier alone could be blocking you from truly hearing from God. Worship, as we know, is a very powerful tool. Has worship in the Bible actually acted upon physical structures, right? Has it acted upon prison walls? Has it acted upon the wall of Jericho, right? Worship alone is able to incite such a strong action that it creates a physical result. I once did a week-long prayer fast, and it was the most intense one I've ever done. And on the last day, there was a call to be doing the devotional focus every hour. By halfway through the day, it was such an intense energy running through my body that I was throwing up like the whole day. I couldn't stop throwing up, but I was like, I made it this far. And it was so intense. So you can be so intensely in the spirit that your physical body has a purging reaction. Right? The purging reaction in some way is from the prayer and meditation I'm doing, but it's not like I'm physically making myself sick. Something's happening in the spirit that's actually allowing something to move out of me. Then we've got sacraments or symbolic acts. So a sacrament is a symbolic act that serves as a rite in Christianity that is ordained by Christ. This is going to include things like baptism and communion. So let's look at Matthew 3:16-17. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God, descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." I felt that one coming. Whew, thank you. So the moment he gets dunked, right? There's an immediate spiritual action that's taking place that then comes back down and creates another physical action. So things can happen that quickly. Matthew 26:26, now as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after the blessing broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." When he's saying this is my body, what is he saying? Is he trying to share in who God has made him to be with his disciples? Right? Before I really came to know Jesus the way I do now, I remember thinking of things like communion and being like, I don't know, it sounds a little like sacrificey, a little weird. I don't know, not into it. But I understand the spiritual transaction now. He's saying, you can have a piece of who I am by sharing in this covenant with me, which eventually he goes on to share with all of us who believe. So for any of you that feel in some of these more symbolic acts a little bit of that like uh-oh feeling, which I know for sure with me in the Abrahamic covenant, when it comes to the act of circumcision. I know that's been a huge area of like, oh God, just why? Why? I don't get it. I still don't get it. God, if you are hearing me right now, I still don't get it. Please bring me revelation so that I can teach it to everybody else, because I still don't get it. But there are certain sacraments that can rub people the wrong way, and I would pray for each of you that have that sort of wall built up around it. Just seek God on the matter. It might not make sense to you. There are still things to me that don't make sense, that I can feel those walls go up in me, but I trust that God will reveal it to me when I'm ready. So if you have those walls up, seek God, and when you're ready, surely he will provide what the deeper answer is. We also have revelation, the communication of a divine truth, bringing to light that which had previously been hidden. So you can actually get to revelation through prayer. You can get to revelation through meditation. Sometimes God will just give you revelation and you weren't doing anything at all. Has that happened to anybody? Where I've literally been in the midst of a very worldly, normal conversation, and all of a sudden it's just like, pow! And then all of a sudden my eyes get really big and they're like, you good? And I'm like, I might need to go grab my phone and write down a couple notes real quick. So sometimes you seek it, sometimes you don't seek it. Either way, it's God actually communicating a divine truth that has been hidden. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 2:13. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. Can people who are not operating in this frequency receive revelation? So this is the important part, and this is why I believe the Bible is so strict about you shall know them by their fruits. People can demonstrate gifting who aren't bearing any fruit. This is God's way of showing us, listen, they might sound like they know what they're saying, they might be saying even all the right things technically, but if their lives don't have abundant fruit, something is a disconnect. You have to use discernment and be observant rather than allow yourself to go in. There are people that can talk like they have revelation. You have to look at their lives, their marriages, their children. That's where we see fruit. Fruit isn't only in their generation. Fruit should be actually observed all over the place. And when I said that in a previous sermon, it created a lot of drama on Instagram, because sometimes people don't take responsibility for the bad fruit that they're experiencing with their kids. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but your kids having bad fruit still goes back to you. That doesn't mean that you caused it or you caused it on purpose, but God is calling us to make sure that our generations are all right with God. So keep that in mind when you're looking to people that are speaking like they have revelation. There are a variety of different ways to observe their fruit. How they live their lives, their marriages, and their kids are all good places to start. So let's look at the new covenant and how we experience physical evidence when this transaction takes place. Because there should be evidence when a spiritual transaction has taken place. There's not always an immediate cause and effect, but we should be able to see it physically manifest, or there be some sort of physical sign after the spiritual transaction is done, which is key. So many people in false light or other spiritual teachings, they look for signs. What do we know to be true biblically? Signs follow you. So signs follow your spiritual transaction. It shouldn't be the other way around. People are like, oh, look, my numbers. I'm going to go there. Look, my numbers. Nope. Sorry to say it. That's the devil. It's not God. A spiritual transaction creates a sign and not the other way around. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. So after this transaction, which for what it's worth, when Jesus cries out and yielded up his spirit, that is the spiritual transaction, okay? So his cry and the yielding of the spirit is the spiritual transaction. And then we see the physical evidence. The curtain tears, the earth shook, and the rocks were split. it's important when we're looking at architecture. Again, those things don't happen and then he cries. We have to always look for the declaration or the intentional spiritual transaction and then the physical sign of it taking place. Your homework is a little bit more extensive than we'd had in the past. Typically with homework, I'm like, yeah, just pray about these things. It's going to be fun. You guys actually have some reading to do. And it's a significant amount of reading. So I need you to read 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And there's a specific reason that I need you to read this whole cluster. This entire cluster of books of the Bible details God's intervention strategies. So now you know the types of transactions that can be. Now you need to understand what sort of situation God actually intervenes with what strategy. And sometimes it's a blend. But we need to understand the situations in which God intervenes and what the instruction is. When we understand the biblical architecture of his intervention strategy, then and only then are we truly ready to be actually out there helping deliver his people. So our next session is called Divine Intervention. But I'm telling you, you're going to miss a whole bunch of keys if you don't read these books. You've got 2 weeks. You can do it. Just do little bits at a time. If you just do a little bit every night, you should get there. So before we get to divine intervention, where we're actually talking about the sequence and the strategy for specific types of manifestations, we need to, again, get clear on what our personal relationship is with each transactional type. Some of you are really good at worshiping, but you're not really very devoted in prayer. Some of you, it's the opposite. You're very devoted in prayer, but in worship, you have this major breakdown. I want you to go through these slides. Mama Tiff, you always put these up on the chainbreakercollective.com. So make sure you go through these slides. I want you to actually sit with each of these spiritual transactional types. Have you done it before? Does it bring up discomfort? Do you get triggered by it? Is this a stronghold that the enemy has over you? Because what I have seen, specific pieces of these spiritual transactions, the enemy will actually make this seem like the thing that triggers you most or the thing you least want to do. Almost always, that is actually where your gifting is. So where we see gifting and anointing, it's usually the area that you are least wanting to press into. So Gordon knows this about me. The whole concept of praying in tongues in front of people bothers me. But I've had it prophesied to me over my life twice by 2 different people that praying in tongues is actually my number 1 gift. So of course, that's the place where I'd be like, ew, I don't want to do that. Right? Because that's the enemy trying to make me turn against actually my most powerful weapon. So I want you to go through each of these spiritual transactional types and figure out, where do you have discomfort? Because I encourage you, press into that discomfort. This week, me and my team did prophetic deliverance baptisms in Lake Ponderay, and it was a truly amazing experience. There's much more of this to come. I want to be able to equip all of you when God is ready for you to get there into being able to do this. There's so many people that need this type of deliverance, and so much of what we experience in day-to-day life in the church is very vanilla. It's very symbolic without the Spirit. We talked a bit on our teaching last Friday for the retreat with baptisms on the idea of kind of like McDonald's baptism, where you just have like hundreds or thousands of people lined up and it's like, do you take Jesus? Right, boom, dunk, okay, go on, dunk, come on. Take a picture, dunk, come on. Maybe there's a lot happening in the Spirit in some churches, but also maybe there's not. Because what I've found to be true is for each person, it required almost 20 to 30 minutes of deliverance for them to even be able to hold a baptism. So I believe this is the work God is calling us into. It's not as simple and symbolic as many people want to believe it is. Just like when people are like, oh, so what are you, you're like hearing things? No, I'm not putting on my fairy godmother costume and going bibbity bobbity boop and hoping something happens. There's an actual order and process to it, and I believe God is ready for us to roll up our sleeves and have him actually reveal these deep truths, because there are a lot of people that need a lot of help, and this is the worst part, there's so many people that are out there doing this type of work, giving it a bad name, and tying it to very harmful financial practices. God is ready to restore that whole thing. People need deliverance, but they don't need deliverance paired with some sort of like burglary of their lives financially. That is not how God's operating at all. When you're doing this type of work, if God tells them to sow into you, great. You should pray about whether you should accept it or not, and that's a whole other teaching. However, to tie this financial sort of exchange to the act of deliverance, in many ways, I think just destroys this beautiful rescuing that God is able to do for his people to restore them back to their original design. So I know that we've been called in this ministry to help create those leaders that can do this for God and God's kingdom and do it justly. So if you feel like you are called, there's a whole lot more coming to this church in that area of the church. So I hope that you will do your homework, take it seriously. Don't like read a couple lines and then show up and be mad that you're missing things 2 Sundays from now, because I'm telling you, if you don't read, you are going to miss things, because I'm not going to go back and fill in the gaps. We're going to go deep. There are going to be a lot of keys because God wants us to get to work. So figure out where those strongholds or areas of discomfort are, because I believe a whole lot of people in this area need a lot of healing. So if you're joining us online, you should come to Sandpoint and come visit. We've got a bunch of guest speakers planned for fall, and we're a great group. You can't see all of us here, but we're delightful, aren't we? We're great. And if you are in this room, it's our end of summer barbecue. We've got a bouncy castle. We're going to have fun. So if you are tuning in online, we will see you in a couple weeks. And if you're here, I hope to see you at my house, 1:30. All right, y'all. See you next time.